Ladies and gentlemen, it's NBA free agency time, or it's almost NBA free agency time. It's NBA free agency time in about a week. And maybe this projects to be a little bit more of a tame draft class because you don't have the Kawhi or the LeBron or the Kevin Durant probably leaving unless some crazy trade happens. But there is a lot of things going on still. So much so that making a separate video about each of them would be impossible. So I'm going to make one video about each of the separate things. You can look down and then skip to whichever thing you want to hear me talk about. I'm going to try to get through as much as I can. I asked on Twitter what you guys wanted me to talk about, so I'm sort of going off of that. But it's funny, as of the recording of this video, or the day that I choose to record this, I think more rumors came out than the last 2 weeks combined. And now I have no idea what to think because you can never tell which rumors are true and which rumors are agents trying to pull the strings and GMs lying and smoke screens and all that. Regardless, let's just get into it. Bradley Beal is maybe the best player that could be on the move. One of the best players that could be on the move. He's up there. I'll be honest, I think the Wizards should be pretty careful. And if I was them and my options were sign him for that like $250 million 5-year deal or let him walk for nothing or for very little in a sign and trade, dude, I'm probably picking to let him walk. And maybe that's a hot take because that would make him a terrible team. But if they sign him to that massive contract, they will also be a terrible team with no cap flexibility. Beal is very good, but he's not a 1A. And your roster is so far from being competitive. And I don't mean like contending. I totally understand that not every team is trying to or not trying, but not every team can build a championship team, right? Like some teams have to be okay with being competitive in the playoffs, and that's still enjoyable to watch for fans, 100%. The Wizards aren't that regardless. And with Beal, if he's not a number one and he's not really a guy that is easy to build around, and you don't have the supporting cast for them to go out and be, even competitive for a playoff spot, really. How far are they from a team like the Cavs, right? Who didn't make the playoffs this year? Pretty far, dude. I just don't see why you would want to lock yourself into that roster. And yeah, it would make you worse in the immediate future, but I almost look at it like the Kemba Walker deal for the Hornets, right? The Hornets were so stupid for letting Kemba Walker walk until he ended up kind of regressing. But even if he hadn't, would signing him to a big bunch of money and locking yourself into a roster that didn't really have a clear path to improving work? Would that be a good long-term solution? Probably not. And with Beal, I even have questions about whether or not he would look good at the end of a 5-year contract. In fact, I feel pretty confident that he won't. He had kind of a down year. He's dealing with injury stuff, and I expect him to bounce back to an extent. But we're talking about giving a number 2 guy number 1 money when the roster's far from complete. It just doesn't seem smart for me. It just doesn't seem smart. Now, don't get me wrong. The Wizards' problem is that they can't draft. They can't draft and develop players, and getting rid of Bradley Beal isn't going to do anything about that. And maybe that's not really their problem. But at some point, I think, honestly, fans are more willing to accept a team that is tanking and is fun and young and looking just to develop talent and maybe not winning a ton of games than they are accepting of a team that is trying desperately to compete and is like an 11 seed or a 12 seed. That's nothing's worse than that. As a Hornets fan, as a longtime Hornets fan, I can tell you I'd rather be the Oklahoma City Thunder, the Detroit Pistons, the Houston Rockets, all those teams having more fun than the Washington Wizards right now. So I think the fans would appreciate having a brighter future. I think locking yourself into the Beal contract would be detrimental. I don't know how much exactly you'd have to pay him, and maybe he doesn't get that much. And there's definitely a price tag where I wouldn't, but I think the Wizards are one of the worst off teams regardless in the NBA, if not the worst off, right? So I would say my opinion on Beal is I'm kind of shaky on whether they should sign him back. As far as where Beal could go, I think the Heat and the Celtics would be the 2 front runners off the top of my head. It's a little tricky because he's expected to decline his player option, meaning that it's a sign and trade, meaning that you have to deal with the sign and trade rules, meaning that it would create a hard cap for any team that trades for him, which is $157 million, and you can't go over it for any reason. Which is tough for a Celtics team that is currently sitting at $157 million in salary cap and a Heat team that's already very expensive. But there's ways to make it work if the Celtics and Heat want to. As far as the Celtics go, I think the fit would definitely be a little bit weird with him and Brown and Tatum, but another playmaker in that offense absolutely can help, although I kind of don't think their problem is a talent thing. I think it's an offense thing. I think it's an offensive scheme thing. I don't think they run enough sets and plays and all that stuff. But he's definitely not going to hurt. right? As far as the Heat go, you can really see it. Their half-court offense is just lacking one more elite explosive guy. They have the salary to match, and they could, send over enough first-round picks to make it happen. Again, in a sign-and-trade, I wouldn't expect the Wizards to get back a whole bunch, but they could get back a couple of picks and start a rebuild. It's not the worst thing in the world. If I were him and the money was comparable, I would go to the Heat or to the Celtics. But if the Wizards are offering me the most money, I'll say this, don't sit here and be like, oh my God, Bradley Beal, you're such an idiot for staying with the Wizards. You're never going to win a ring if he gets like a $200 million contract. If I had a $200 million contract offer, we could win 10 games a year, right? Like, who cares? But we'll see. I think it might be better for both parties if Bradley Beal is not on the Wizards next year. Somebody asked in my Twitter, DeAndre Ayton and Miles Bridges getting the max. I've already talked about DeAndre Ayton at length in another video, so I'm not going to hit on that too hard. I do think Ayton is going to get the max. I feel pretty strongly about it. If he couldn't command the max in free agency, he wouldn't be having this problem with the Suns right now where they're not willing to give him the max, So I think he does. I think he's really young, number 1 overall pick, can still grow a lot. A team like Detroit or Portland should definitely be after him as they're not, getting free agents like this. And that's kind of the advantage of having a borderline max player, right? Like a lot of times if a guy's obviously a max contract, right? Smaller market teams can't have the advantage of trying to pay him more than other dudes, right? Let's say Giannis was a free agent, right? You couldn't outspend any other team because every single team would be willing to give him any amount of money, right? But with Ayton, he's a borderline max guy. So if you offer him the max, it puts you ahead for a really, really great player still, but maybe one that's not quite so good that everyone's going to be offering him the money that he wants, and it makes it easier to go get him. So I think for teams like Portland and Detroit and the Hornets, although I think that's really unlikely as of now with the reports that I've seen, they should absolutely be offering him the max. I do. I think also realistic teams are maybe the Bulls, although I think the money of that is really hard to make work, or the Hawks, who I listed as my favorite in my video, if they want to go get him and pay that money. And I don't think it'd be a bad decision. As far as Miles Bridges go, here's my opinion. I would give him the max if I were the Hornets, if I had to. Like, if you let him hit free agency, let him go get whatever offer he can go get. If it's a max contract, you can't let him walk. Not an option. He is worth the max to them. He is one of the best 2 players on the team. He fits the timeline. It's like, if the Hornets are going to be good, it's going to be because him and LaMelo and some of these other young guys develop. Letting that guy walk because of money that you're not even going to be able to go spend on any player that's any better because you're one of the smallest market teams is dumb management. And they've been weird about the money because they're like the brokest team in the NBA. And they're pitiful, and they've just been doing pitiful things for the last week with Kenny Atkinson, and now everybody's up for trade because they don't want to go into the luxury tax, and it's a mess. But the Hornets are going to pay Miles Bridges, I think, I hope. And it seems like he wants to stay, too. That's the other thing. How many good young stars really want to stay in Charlotte, too? And he's like best buds with LaMelo. It would just suck if they weren't on the same team. It would bum me out so much, too, because they like playing with each other so much and they play off of each other so well. Is it a risk to give Miles the max? Yeah, but you got to gamble sometimes on this stuff. That's the way that it goes. No fully guaranteed $150 million contract is going to come with no risk, especially with how much leverage players have. So do I think he'll get the max? Probably right under it, but I think for the Hornets, it shouldn't matter. They should just be saying, we're paying him no matter what. Don't care. If he can go get a max offer, sucks. Love to pay him less. Too bad. The next guy is Jalen Brunson. How much money is he going to get? Are the Mavs going to re-sign him? Who else is after him? There's a report today that the Knicks were thinking about him and trying to free up cap space for him. My thought on Brunson is that he's a very nice young player. And it's pretty easy to see how much money he's going to get. I look at him like, he's 23 years old. He could still get a decent amount better, but he is a smaller guard. He can create his own shot. He does some nice things on offense. He's probably around Terry Rozier money. And I'd say the same thing about Simons in Portland. I'd say the same thing about Jordan Poole. Those type of guys usually get between 20 and 25 million bucks a year, I would say. Not quite the max, but, pretty respectable. It seems like the Mavs are going to be pretty aggressive in trying to sign him back, and they should be. That's the best thing that they can do with their money, and if later they decide they need to trade him, like next offseason, they say Brunson's not the best fit, they can still do that. If they let him walk now, their options in free agency, especially for a sign and trade, just aren't going to be there because their roster is already so expensive. For the Mavs, that hard cap is something that's going to be really hard to make work. So trying to go and get like a guy like Ayton or maybe a Beal, if that's something they're thinking about, is going to be really, really tough for them because not only do they have a lot of money, but they have a lot of money in contracts that are not super, super, super amazing. And they also are limited in picks for the next couple of years because of the Christian Wood trade. The way I look at them, I think Christian Wood was the move that they were planning to make, and I would like them to go and make another, move. I really think a defensive 5 is really what they needed. But like, dude, I think Cuban seems pretty committed to keeping Brunson, and I doubt that he's going to get outbid, but it's not unthinkable. As far as the Knicks go, I actually think that signing Brunson to some big deal is like a pretty unserious move. That team is nowhere close to being like super, super competitive. They can probably rebound a little bit from last year. Brunson is a very nice player, but I'm just saying a team that is spending all their money on Julius Randle and Brunson and Fournier is setting their ceiling pretty low. As a team. They're a first round exit. Probably, like, that's probably around what they'd be, right? And I think that the Knicks would be much better suited to like try to get off of the bad contracts, work on developing these young guys they've been drafting, because the Knicks have quietly not been drafting terribly recently. They've had some solid picks. Toppin looked good at the end of the year. RJ Barrett has shown some flashes, although we're kind of getting to the point where it's like, dude, you gotta really be more consistent and really be more efficient. But still, I think that's a path they should head down. Not trying to push for a playoff exit. I think the introduction of the plans has led one too many teams to try to do that, which is, I guess, the goal of them, right? Less teams tanking, but from a team perspective, it may not be the best thing if you're fighting for like the 9 seed, right? So my thoughts on Brunson is that he's pretty likely to stay. I've seen some rumors to Detroit too. They could offer him, but I think you'd have to put forward a pretty serious, pretty legit offer to pry him away from the Mavericks right now, because they just don't have any better options other than re-signing him. And unless he falls off the face of the earth, or unless you pay him like the super max or whatever, he should be, a tradable guy if it comes to that. Another point guard who is maybe a little bit more infamous, Kyrie Irving. This whole situation is like, it's a disaster for the Nets. The poor Nets, dude. They did the Kevin Garnett debacle, trade all the picks thing, and then they finally dug themselves out of that hole and then immediately did it again. And it's bordering on blowing up in their face again. If they don't get Kyrie back, they're cooked. No. Here's the thing. If I had told you before the offseason that Kyrie and the Nets were going to have a hard time coming to terms, you would have said, like, yeah, that makes sense. Of course they are. Kyrie is going to want a long contract. The Nets are not going to want to give it to him, but the Nets really need to keep him. And Kyrie really wants to stay with Kevin Durant. So it's going to be a tough negotiation process. But then we get into the offseason and you get to that tough negotiation process, and all of a sudden people panic a little bit more than maybe they should. I made a video about the Nets earlier and I said, oh, they'll re-sign him no matter what. Don't even worry about it. And it's definitely not that much of a guarantee, but I still lean that he's probably more likely to re-sign. In fact, I ran a poll on it on my Twitter today. 31% of people think he's staying. 69% think that he's not. I would say that the odds are at least 50-50 that he does, if not higher. And that's for a few reasons. Number one, the Nets, if they sign and trade him away, they will not get equal value, right? That's how sign and trades are. If they don't, they're not competing at all. And Kevin Durant could very easily be out the door and you've completely blown it up. And I know that they don't want to give Kyrie a long contract because he probably won't be worth it by the end of that. Like in 5 years, yeah, he's probably not going to be worth $40 million, right? But that's kind of the sacrifice you have to make if you want to sign guys like these, right? Now, I understand with Kyrie, it's an even bigger risk than maybe like Jimmy Butler's on a contract that pays him $50 million when he's like 36 or 37 or whatever. Yeah, that's not great. But with Kyrie, you don't trust him now, right? And I don't even mean that from like, he's just such a crazy guy. I mean that from like a health standpoint, honestly. He hasn't played a full season in 5 years. So I get it from that standpoint with Brooklyn. And I also get that they're broke. People like to make out that, money doesn't really matter to these owners. And maybe it shouldn't, you could argue. Maybe they should be more focused on winning than making money. But that's not how it works in real life. And the Nets are losing money. And signing Kyrie to a big deal is going to make the team cost an insane amount. Their luxury tax hit is ridiculous. That being said, I think that easily their best option as far as from a basketball standpoint is re-signing him. It's that, or you're probably going to end up blowing the team up here. And I really doubt they want to do that a year and a half after they made the James Harden trade, right? And for Kyrie, I kind of think that signing back is also his best option. Like you saw those reports of like, oh, now he's considering the Knicks and the Lakers. And dude, the Knicks, I have a really hard time seeing him going there, right? I mean, with the Knicks, they're not going to be a contending team with Kyrie. And with the Lakers, it's hard to imagine how that trade would even work. The only guy they can match salary with is Russell Westbrook. The Clippers were also in those rumors, and I'll say this. Clippers, very expensive roster, hard to make the sign and trade work if you can. There are worse things to do. I think if he's going to leave, I think it'll be to the Clippers. That would be my guess. But I think, he went to Brooklyn with the express point of playing with Kevin Durant. I think that still matters to him. I think he still wants to play with the Nets. I think the Nets, if they can get on the court, get some chemistry, add maybe a couple more defensive rotational players, absolutely they could be a lot better. They just need to retool that roster. But it starts with bringing guys back. My guess is that he stays. It's up in the air. It's hard to tell. I would guess still that he stays. Brooklyn just letting him walk and deciding we give up would be pretty unprecedented. But unprecedented things tend to happen with Kyrie Irving. I'll give you guys that. Somebody asked me what the Hawks should do. I'm probably not going to do every single team, but I will do what I think they should do. I really think DeAndre Ayton is the path to go. If you can pull that off, absolutely. The thing about him is like, if you're looking at some of the teams that are after him, they're all kind of a little bit smaller markets, maybe a little bit of underdogs when it comes to going and getting him. If you're aggressive, you're a bigger market, and you would tell him you get to play with Trae Young and you'd get to be part of a young core, like Trae Young fits his timeline, I really think he would say yes. I mean, I don't know the guy, obviously. We haven't talked too much, but I would think that if Atlanta's offering a max, that's a no-brainer. And then on the other side of that, I think that if I'm the Suns and I'm looking at what offers I'm going to get in free agency for Ayton in a sign and trade, which again are probably not going to be that high because it's a sign and trade, like Clint Capella and Herter would be kind of a really good haul. Two pretty solid players who just aren't on that big long contract that you'd be scared of if you're the Suns. That could be, I think, a lot stronger than, what would the Hornets offer? Gordon Hayward? What would, some of these other teams like the Pistons probably not even going to need to match all that salary, or Portland kind of just has partially guaranteed contract type stuff. So I think the Hawks should go after Ayton. And in that offense, I think he could be allowed to have a little bit bigger role, and you'd need to see him develop more as a guy who can really go take people on one-on-one and really expose mismatches and all that stuff. But on the other end, he's a good defensive center, very switchable, handles pick and roll well, all that good stuff. So if I were them and I had, Ayton and Young and Hunter, like that's not bad at all. I think that's maybe the best thing that the Hawks could do to move off of kind of the older pieces they want to move away from and try to become younger with higher ceiling and trying to become a little bit younger. I think that'd make them a pretty decently high ceiling team. You'd be banking on Ayton's development, but there's worse things you can do. And if you sign him to a big contract and 2 years from now you want to trade him, it's probably not going to be impossible to do it. Okay, I'll do another team because this person asked about Bulls free agency options. I really want them to just go out and get somebody who can defend the five a little bit better. They have a lot of really good perimeter defenders. That defense could be one of the best in the league, but Vucevic kind of holds them back. And I know they've invested a lot to go get Vucevic, and that is maybe one of the worst trades. Or it's one of the lower tier trades a team has made in the last few years because it really has not worked out for them. But I think if you have the option to go get like a Turner or a Jakob Poeltl, or I know Gobert is the guy that's getting rumored a lot, I think it could really change what they can do defensively. And maybe having an offense that is really good but not amazing would be something that you could deal with. And you could totally see that as a team making a run to the conference finals if things break their way. The good news is that it sounds like they're going to get Levine back. So being a little bit more aggressive is probably on the table for that Bulls team. But even if they don't want to go make the big Rudy Gobert trade, which I kind of understand, if you go and get like Mitchell Robinson or a Mo Bamba, like just somebody who maybe is just going to come off the bench, I think it would be at least the interesting, serious. Like there's some in between from like doing nothing and going all out that the Bulls could do with one of those two moves, right? I lied about not doing teams because this person's asking about the Warriors extensions. I think they just pay everybody because that's just what the Warriors can do. The big thing with them is you look at like, okay, their roster right now is very expensive. It's $170 million, which is about as expensive as rosters get. And all of a sudden, they need to re-sign Kevon Looney. They need to re-sign Gary Payton. They need to give Poole an extension. They need to give Wiggins an extension. And if you were to do all of those things, right, like if all that money hit now, the roster would be unbelievably expensive and they couldn't cover it. And that's just the way the luxury tax gets. It gets so expensive, right? Here is the thing that people are, I think, not taking into account. Klay Thompson is making $40 million next year, but that is an expiring deal. Jordan Poole and Andrew Wiggins are already on contract for next season. Jordan Poole for basically no money, Wiggins for 30. If you give those guys new contracts, they're not going to hit until you're off of Klay Thompson's money. And if he chooses to re-sign, it's certainly not going to be for $40 million. As far as Looney and Gary Payton go, yeah, maybe you do have to make a little bit of a choice there. And you can't bring them both back. But the Warriors seem pretty committed to keeping this roster going. They just won a championship. They've been known to go all out and spend and spend and spend. And they've been spending for years and years and years. So I honestly think that worst case scenario, they lose one of Looney and Gary Payton. Now, the question is like, do you want to pay Wiggins and Poole like what they're asking for? Which Wiggins will probably ask for near the max. And Poole's asking, it seems like, the report I saw today, don't take my word for it, it's $100 million for 4 years. It's $25 million a year. Wiggins, I would say you probably got to, right? Like you probably have. And here's what I would say. If you're comfortable with it, maybe you say Wiggins will pony up. You were the second best player on the team. Like he is so important to them. And maybe it won't quite be the max, but I know that's something that NBA fans don't like to hear because I think that level of player is never considered a max player. But usually they kind of are pushing that boundary. Like what people think a max player is and who actually gets the max is like, there's a pretty big discrepancy, right? But with like, can you let him walk? No, I guess you can wait a year, but then he's an unrestricted free agent. Maybe you want to see him do this one more time before you give him that money. But if you could get him for anything under, if you could get him for that like $25 million a year, although that would be a pay cut from what he's making now, I think you'd do it. With Poole, I think there's a really strong argument to wait and not pay him this offseason. Poole has been really good, but he has been super inconsistent. And maybe he projects to get better. So I feel like if they do sign him, I feel like odds are it's going to work out and next year he'll be even better and it'll cost even more. But the thing is that if he's asking that close to max, like only, $5 million under the max contract, and he's only really been at this level for one season and he was pretty inconsistent in the playoffs, you could say, I'll tell you what, you're a restricted free agent anyway next year, right? I'm going to wait this year out, let you play it out on a contract year. And if you turn out being great and continuing to improve, awesome. Lost $5 million a year, sucks, but it's not that big a deal. Whereas if you pay him now and it doesn't work out, which again, I think is against the odds, but still, you're in the hole pretty bad. So I think maybe giving Poole and Gary Payton and Looney and Wiggins all extensions is going to be pretty expensive. But I think maybe you lose one of those role players. Maybe you wait on one of Wiggins or Poole. But I think, again, with Klay Thompson coming off all that money next year and those extra contracts you'd be giving to Poole and Wiggins not coming into effect next year, they're actually in a lot better of a spot than you'd think they are. And I thought for a while they were going to have to drop one of Wiggins and Poole. I don't think they have to if they don't want to. The Warriors just kill it, man. And then last one, Russell Westbrook. There's been some rumblings that maybe he'll go to the Hornets and they want to open up their money and trade Rozier and then Hayward and do that big deal and then get like the expiring. And, Russell Westbrook's a Jordan Brand guy. I think that would be a pretty extreme thing. My guess is that Westbrook stays put if the Lakers aren't willing to give up that first. I don't think they are. I don't think they want to be aggressive. I don't even think Westbrook's their biggest problem, honestly. So I would say that if he does get moved, it's going to be for like cap space sake, like the Hornets or maybe the Pacers would do it. But if they're not willing to give up that first, the number of teams willing to do that, very limited, very limited. So I wouldn't have too high expectations for that. Although anything could change. Maybe the Lakers decide they do want to get aggressive. Maybe the Hornets really need the money that bad to open up next year. So who knows? But that probably about does it for me. I know I didn't cover, honestly, as many topics as I thought I would. So I'll tell you this. If you guys want to talk about something else in the comments, I'll make sure to keep up with them the best that I can and then try to respond to as many as I can. But yeah, make sure to do all the other stuff you're supposed to do on YouTube videos, like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Go watch all the rest of our videos all the way through. Full retention time, please. But I'll catch y'all next time.